The Senate chamber buzzed with tension, cameras flashing like lightning in a storm. Every network carried the broadcast live. MSNBC, CNN, even Fox couldn't resist the heat brewing inside that room. The chyrons scrolled across screens in bold red. Crockett versus Cornyn, live. Senator John Cornyn leaned forward, eyes narrow, lips curling into a smirk only years of privilege could perfect. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, his voice cutting through the murmur. "Some of us came here to legislate, not to perform for the cameras." Gasps rippled through the chamber. A few senators shifted uncomfortably. The insult wasn't new, but the target, Jasmine Crockett, was never one to be underestimated. She didn't flinch. Didn't frown. Didn't even blink. Instead, she smiled. Slow, calm, and deliberate. That smile wasn't submission. It was warning. Cornyn paused, unsure whether to continue. He had expected outrage, a retort, maybe even the kind of back and forth he could later twist on cable news. But silence? That threw him off balance. The power in her restraint was louder than any outburst could ever be. On social media, the clips spread like wildfire. Tweets popped up by the second. Did Crockett just smile at Cornyn like that? This is history in the making. Crockett vs. Cornyn. Senate Showdown. The hearing room felt like a powder keg, one spark away from explosion. Reporters leaned in, phones raised, ready to capture what everyone sensed was about to happen. Cornyn cleared his throat, forcing a laugh that sounded more like a stumble. "Well, Congresswoman? No response?" Her eyes lifted to meet his, unbothered, focused, the kind of gaze that spoke without words. You'll regret that sentence. Across the country, living rooms fell silent. Viewers didn't know it yet, but they were watching the birth of a viral legend, a political confrontation that would echo far beyond Washington's marble walls. Cornyn leaned closer again, unaware he'd already lost the moment. The battle lines were drawn, but the real story hadn't even begun. But before she spoke, America remembered who Jasmine Crockett really was. The confrontation that had the nation on edge didn't come out of nowhere. This wasn't a routine Senate hearing. It was a reckoning dressed in formality. The agenda read, Government Accountability and Ethical Conduct. But beneath the polished title, everyone knew what it really was, a televised battlefield for power and credibility. John Cornyn sat like a man who'd been here 1,000 times before. He'd survived administrations, scandals, and a dozen televised hearings. To him, this was just another day, another chance to remind the newcomers where they stood in the hierarchy. His cufflinks gleamed under the lights, his posture rehearsed, his tone sharpened for dominance. Across the table, Jasmine Crockett represented something different, something the old guard didn't quite know how to contain. She wasn't just younger. She was louder in truth, clearer in purpose, and unapologetically unafraid of the space she occupied. Outside the frame, aides exchanged nervous glances. The tension in the room had its own pulse. Every word Cornyn spoke dripped with the assumption that experience equaled entitlement, and Crockett's presence challenged that equation. "Congresswoman," he said again, voice heavy with patronizing calm. "Perhaps if you'd spent a few more years in the trenches of governance, you'd understand the complexities of ethics." There it was, the jab, subtle enough to sound professional, sharp enough to cut through pride. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. Reporters' fingers flew across keyboards. Headlines formed in real time. Cornyn schools freshman Congresswoman. Senate hearing turns tense. But the camera caught what the commentary missed. Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned back slightly, eyes locked on Cornyn with the patience of someone who had seen worse and outlasted better. What Cornyn failed to understand was that this wasn't about seniority. It was about something far deeper. Who gets to define credibility in America? For decades, men like him had dictated the terms of respectability. They decided whose passion counted as leadership and whose counted as attitude. They built walls with language and hierarchy, but on this day, facing Jasmine Crockett, that world was cracking. The subtext of the moment wasn't lost on anyone watching. Viewers at home weren't just seeing a political disagreement. They were seeing generations collide, the past holding its ground against a future that refused to ask permission. Inside the chamber, you could almost hear the heartbeat of change. The air was thick. The silence before her response stretched like a drawn bowstring. Everyone knew one thing. When she finally spoke, the shot would land where it hurt. Cornyn shifted again, forcing a chuckle to break the tension. "Well, Congresswoman, I'll make this simple for you." That line sealed his mistake. The words "simple for you" hit harder than any shout could. It was more than condescension. It was the casual dismissal of everything she represented. And yet, Crockett didn't rush to defend herself. Her stillness spoke louder than rebuttal. It was the kind of composure that came from weathering storms far rougher than this. A reminder that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just waits for the perfect moment to strike. What no one in that room realized, not the aides, not the cameras, not even Cornyn himself, was that the balance of this debate had already shifted. But the senator had no idea. The woman he was trying to belittle had already fought tougher battles long before this room. Long before that Senate hearing went viral, John Cornyn had built a name that carried weight. To his peers, he was the definition of composure. Steady, articulate, and unshakably confident. A man molded by decades of political trench warfare. From courthouse floors to the U.S. Senate, Cornyn had climbed every rung with precision, every step calculated, every handshake memorized. In his early years, he was admired for his discipline. He believed in order, decorum, and hierarchy. The system, to him, was sacred, a ladder that rewarded those who played by its rules. And for a time, that faith worked. The committees he chaired, the deals he brokered, the speeches he delivered, all reflected a man who saw himself as the guardian of a certain political dignity. But the country around him changed faster than he did. The rise of social media blurred the line between governance and performance. The voices once confined to the margins now spoke directly to millions. For a man like Cornyn, this wasn't evolution. It was erosion. He saw it as the fall of civility, the collapse of respect for tradition. And when figures like Jasmine Crockett appeared, young, outspoken, unapologetic, something in him recoiled. To Cornyn, she represented a new kind of politics he neither understood nor trusted, a politics of emotion, rawness, and confrontation. He watched her speeches go viral and saw chaos, not courage. He heard passion in her tone and labeled it recklessness. Politics, he often said in private, used to be about governance. Now it's about grandstanding. In truth, that line had become his armor, the phrase he repeated whenever he felt the ground shifting beneath him. But the irony was bitter. What he dismissed as performance was, for millions, authenticity. And what he called decorum had begun to sound like dismissal, a relic of a system that once silenced anyone who didn't fit its mold. Behind closed doors, staffers noticed it. His tone was sharper now, his patience thinner. Committee meetings that once ran with quiet efficiency often turned into lectures. When young aides offered progressive data points or new perspectives, Cornyn brushed them off with a polite but cutting line. "You'll understand once you've been here long enough." He didn't see arrogance. He saw experience. But to everyone else, it was entitlement. The kind that dripped from every syllable he used when addressing newcomers like Crockett. Clips from past hearings began to resurface. Instances where Cornyn interrupted mid-sentence. Moments where he used sarcasm instead of substance. None of it seemed damning on its own, until the pattern started to emerge. The way he'd lean back when younger women spoke. The smirk that flickered when someone challenged his view. And in the age of endless replay, those little gestures became louder than his words. There was a time when Cornyn had been praised for his composure, but somewhere along the way that composure hardened into condescension. It wasn't that he stopped believing in his principles. It was that he stopped believing anyone else's could matter as much. He'd begun to measure worth by tenure, not truth. In his mind, the country was full of amateurs trying to rewrite the rules he had spent decades mastering. Every viral moment, every passionate speech from a younger lawmaker felt like an attack on the very structure he'd dedicated his life to preserving. So, when Jasmine Crockett spoke up, when she refused to shrink, refused to yield, Cornyn didn't just hear her words. He heard defiance, and defiance to him had no place in order. What Cornyn failed to recognize was that this wasn't the same America he'd once governed. The public wasn't applauding composure anymore. They were demanding conviction. They weren't inspired by stoic discipline. They were moved by truth unfiltered. The very traits that made Cornyn powerful in the old world were making him irrelevant in the new one. And deep down, he felt it. That creeping insecurity disguised as confidence. That's why, in that hearing room, he leaned harder on arrogance. Why his jabs came quicker. Why his voice carried that subtle edge of irritation. Because somewhere inside, he wasn't just debating Jasmine Crockett. He was fighting irrelevance itself. He saw in her what he could never be again. Bold, unbothered, and free from the weight of old expectations. The moment replayed in his mind before it even ended. Her calm silence, her slight smile, the crowd's restless anticipation. And yet, instead of stepping back, he doubled down. Cornyn leaned forward, eyes narrowing, his words dripping with certainty, the same certainty that had once made him powerful. Now teetering on the edge of self-destruction, he had no idea the tide had already turned, and as Cornyn leaned in to deliver one more jab, he didn't notice that Crockett was done playing defense. Before the flashing cameras and the viral headlines, Jasmine Crockett's story began far from the marble halls of Washington. It started in the South, where the air was thick with heat and history, and every dream felt like a rebellion. She grew up watching her community fight battles that most of the country pretended not to see. Her mother worked double shifts. Her father carried quiet dignity, and the lesson was simple. If the world won't give you a seat, build your own table. As a child, she was the one who asked too many questions. Why do some people get treated better than others? Why do the rules change depending on who's in the room? Those questions didn't fade, they sharpened. They became the reason she stayed up late, studying law books she could barely afford, pushing through exhaustion because quitting never felt like an option. Law school wasn't glamorous. It was fluorescent lights and empty pockets. It was being the only black woman in a seminar and having her intelligence questioned before she ever spoke. But Jasmine learned quickly she didn't need their validation to prove her worth. Every condescending smile, every dismissive glance became fuel. She didn't chase comfort. She chased justice. When she graduated, she didn't run toward corporate firms or cushy offices. She went where the system cracked the hardest, to courtrooms where people couldn't afford lawyers, where injustice wasn't theoretical, but lived. She stood beside the voiceless, the overlooked, the forgotten, and won cases no one thought she could. Those early years carved something unshakable in her. Dignity, she learned, isn't silence, it's strategy. There were days when judges mistook her for an assistant. Days when opposing counsel underestimated her because of her youth, her gender, or the color of her skin. But every time they tried to cut her down, she met them with precision. Not volume, not outrage, precision. She'd let them talk. Let them reveal their assumptions. And when the time came, she'd dismantle their arguments piece by piece, leaving no trace of arrogance behind. That was her quiet rebellion, turning underestimation into weaponry. Her reputation grew, not as the loudest voice in the room, but the one that made people listen. By the time she stepped into public service, she'd already spent years in the trenches. She'd seen how laws looked on paper and how they broke people in practice. She knew that change wasn't poetic. It was procedural, exhausting, and often thankless. Yet she kept showing up. When she first ran for office, they said she was too young, too bold, too uncompromising. Wait your turn, they told her. But waiting wasn't her nature. She didn't run because it was easy. She ran because she was tired of watching those who'd never known struggle decide the fate of those who lived it every day. Campaigning wasn't glamorous either. It was handshakes in parking lots, speeches in church basements, doors slammed in her face, and 1,000 small yeses that slowly turned into victory. And when she finally won, it wasn't just a seat, it was a statement. Every time she walked into Congress, she carried those who never got the chance. Every speech she gave, every bill she fought for, echoed with the voices of those left behind, and though the spotlight often sought to reduce her to the fiery new Congresswoman, she wasn't performing. She was persevering. Her calm wasn't compliance. It was command. Her mentors used to tell her, "You don't need to raise your voice to raise the room." That wisdom became her armor, because she understood something her critics never could. Power isn't in the pitch of your tone. It's in the precision of your truth. Behind that composure was the memory of every courtroom where she'd been underestimated and every injustice she'd witnessed. She knew what it meant to be talked over, dismissed, and mocked, and she knew how to turn that energy back on itself. By the time she sat across from Cornyn in that Senate hearing, she wasn't intimidated. She wasn't nervous. She'd been here before, maybe not in this building, but in spirit. This wasn't her first man with a title trying to test her composure. It wasn't her first time being called emotional for caring or performative for speaking truth. She'd learned long ago that the louder they get, the more they reveal their fear. Cornyn's arrogance didn't shake her. It reminded her of every obstacle she'd already overcome. His condescension wasn't new. It was familiar, predictable. She sat there, posture unbroken, eyes steady, the embodiment of grace under fire. To the audience watching, it looked like patience. To her, it was power. Because while Cornyn believed he was teaching her a lesson in humility, Jasmine was preparing to give him a masterclass in dignity. She wasn't improvising. She was executing. Years of trial work, advocacy, and quiet endurance had prepared her for this exact moment. And when she smiled in that hearing, that small, knowing smile that silenced the room, it wasn't hesitation. It was mastery. Everything she had ever learned, every scar she carried, every victory hard-earned in spaces that doubted her, all of it converged in that silence. Cornyn thought he was addressing a freshman congresswoman. What he didn't realize was that he was standing in the courtroom she built. So when Cornyn tried to corner her, he didn't realize. He'd just stepped into her courtroom. The hearing room hums with an uneasy energy, a quiet that isn't silence but pressure, the kind that tightens before a storm breaks. Every camera is trained on the dais. Every journalist has their fingers poised over keyboards. Senator John Cornyn leans forward, his voice cutting through the static. "Congresswoman," he begins, tone heavy with irritation, "perhaps you should focus on facts rather than feelings." The words land like a slap dressed as civility. A few aides behind him smirk. Reporters exchange knowing looks. Another classic Cornyn moment. The senator, seasoned in rhetorical sparring, expects the same routine. The opponent flustered, defensive, small. But Jasmine Crockett doesn't flinch. She simply exhales. Controlled and measured, the kind of breath that precedes precision. Her eyes lift to meet his. Calm. Centered. Grounded. When she finally speaks, her voice doesn't rise. It steadies. "Senator," she says softly, "facts are all I've ever dealt in. No rebuttal. No raised tone. Just truth served cold." The air shifts. The murmurs quiet. The sound of a pen dropping on a desk feels thunderous in the stillness that follows. Cornyn tries to smile, but it's forced. The kind of smile meant to reassert control, yet betraying irritation. He adjusts his tie, clears his throat, and goes again. "Then perhaps, Congresswoman, you can explain why your so-called facts seem to align perfectly with your emotions." That's when the cameras start closing in, lenses zooming, searching for the flicker of emotion, the misstep, the breaking point. But they find none. Crockett doesn't blink. She leans forward just enough to close the distance, her gaze unwavering. "Senator," she says, the rhythm of her tone almost surgical, "emotion without evidence is chaos. Evidence without empathy is tyranny. I choose balance. The murmurs return, but now they're different. Not mockery, not dismissal, something closer to awe. Cornyn's jaw tightens. The veteran debater senses the shift. The crowd leaning toward her, the power slipping from his grasp. He raises his voice slightly, a trace of frustration bleeding through. Balance doesn't belong in oversight hearings, Congresswoman. Facts do. Her lips curve slightly. Not a smirk, but a signal. A knowing calm. Then let's talk about facts, she replies. The fact that accountability isn't bias. The fact that integrity doesn't require seniority. The fact that experience means nothing if it's used to silence progress. The words land heavier than volume ever could. Each syllable deliberate, weighted, and echoing beyond the microphones. Cornyn shifts in his chair. His face strains to maintain composure, but the confidence that once filled the room has thinned. He tries to regain footing, his voice now more defensive than dominant. I don't appreciate being lectured on integrity by someone still learning the ropes. This time, Crockett doesn't answer immediately. She lets silence do what words cannot. 5 seconds, 10. Every second, the tension grows denser. More electric. Her stillness isn't submission, it's control. When she finally speaks, her voice is almost a whisper, but every syllable cuts through. Senator, I've spent my life learning ropes, the kind that bind justice, tie people down, and strangle truth. So if you think experience means watching in silence, I'm afraid I learned differently. The line lands like a strike, not explosive, but seismic. Cameras flash. Pens fly. Somewhere, a reporter mutters, "That's the headline." Cornyn opens his mouth, but the words stall. He glances at the committee chair, looking for refuge in formality, but none comes. The room, once tilted in his favor, now leans toward her, not because she shouted, but because she didn't need to. Her calm becomes its own kind of thunder. Every movement, every pause feels deliberate. Cornyn, louder now, is trying to reclaim ground that no longer exists. His sentences stumble, overlapping, his certainty fading beneath her composure. It's not a debate anymore. It's an unraveling. Because while Cornyn talks, Crockett listens, and the crowd watches her. The stillness, the precision, the unshaken dignity. When she finally breaks her silence again, she doesn't raise her voice. She lowers it. "The louder you get, Senator," she says, eyes locked on him, "the more your argument disappears." And the room stops breathing. In that moment, every spectator in person or online knows they've just witnessed the spark before the explosion. And then, with one line, Jasmine flipped the entire narrative. The moment hangs in the air, tense, fragile, electric. Cornyn's words are still echoing faintly, but the room has shifted. The audience, the staffers, even the journalists can sense it. Something is about to happen. Jasmine Crockett leans forward, not in aggression, but in intent. Her hand rests lightly on her notes, untouched, unnecessary. Her eyes lift toward Cornyn with that same measured calm that's become her signature. When she finally speaks, her tone is steady, surgical. "Senator," she begins, "you mentioned accountability. Let's start there." Her words glide through the chamber. No rush, no filler. Each syllable lands with purpose. She flips a document before her, scanning the page only long enough to remind him she doesn't need it. "You've spoken today about government transparency," she continues, "and yet you've voted 3 times against measures that would have made corporate lobbying disclosures public, including one you co-sponsored before walking it back last year. Why?" Cornyn blinks, caught between surprise and indignation. "Congresswoman, that's—" But Crockett doesn't interrupt. She lets him start. Then she lets him stop. "I just want to understand, Senator," she says evenly. "If accountability is only convenient when it protects power, is it still accountability?" The silence that follows is deafening. Her voice doesn't rise, it lowers. And somehow, that makes it louder. Across the room, cameras refocus. The feed producers in control rooms across the country lean forward. The balance of energy, once tilting toward Cornyn, now gravitates to her completely. She continues, seamless, unflinching. "You've said that emotion clouds judgment. But empathy, Senator, isn't emotion, it's understanding. And without understanding, Governance becomes dictation. Cornyn shifts. With all due respect, but again, Crockett's composure holds the space. She nods, acknowledging him. Not conceding, just controlling. With all due respect, Senator, she counters, you speak of respect as if it's something granted by seniority. I see it as something earned through service. And I don't mean years in office. I mean years of showing up for people who can't afford to hire a lobbyist to speak for them. Her tone sharpens, but her voice stays soft. The paradox is powerful. She's calm, yet cutting. The journalists in the back start typing faster. The transcript will later read like poetry, but in real time, it feels like a reckoning. Cornyn clears his throat. Congresswoman, I think perhaps you're misunderstanding. Crockett tilts her head slightly. Senator, I understand perfectly. I understand that when I fight for ethics reform, you call it grandstanding. When you do the same, you call it leadership. A ripple of quiet gasps rolls through the gallery. She doesn't stop. I understand that every time a woman like me, young, black, unapologetic, and stands her ground, someone says she's too emotional. But when a man raises his voice in anger, it's called passion. Cornyn's lips tighten. His eyes dart briefly toward the cameras that, for the first time all afternoon, are no longer pointed at him. Crockett pauses, lets the words breathe, then adds, accountability isn't a performance, Senator. It's a principle, and that's what the people sent me here to protect. The line drops like a gavel. For a moment, the entire room is still. No applause, no chatter. Just silence, the kind that swells, not empties. Cornyn leans back slowly, blinking. He's not defeated by insult. He's undone by truth. Somewhere in the press gallery, a reporter whispers, that's it. That's the moment. But Crockett isn't finished. Her voice softens even further, turning from confrontation to conviction. You see, the difference between us, Senator, isn't age or title. It's understanding that power isn't meant to be preserved. It's meant to be used to protect. Her words echo like a sermon in marble. The hearing room feels sacred for a second, not because of politics, but because of clarity. Then the pivot. The one that will make every highlight real. She looks straight into the camera, unflinching. If truth sounds loud to you, maybe it's because it's echoing where silence used to be. There it is. The line. It lands not as a mic drop, but as a revelation. The kind of moment that crystallizes why she's sitting there, why she matters, why the old playbook no longer works. Cornyn opens his mouth, then closes it again. There's nothing to add, nothing to spin. The chair clears his throat awkwardly, sensing the seismic shift. Thank you, Congresswoman. The time is yielded, but no one moves. Every person in that chamber, from aide to anchor, knows they've just witnessed something that will live beyond this day. Within minutes, the clip hits social media. Within hours, it trends across every major platform. Headlines explode. Crockett ends Cornyn with calm precision. Jasmine Crockett's silence speaks louder than Cornyn's decades. Power shift in real time. Hashtags rise. Think pieces form. Late-night hosts replay the clip. Commentators dissect her tone, her posture, her precision. Some praise her. Some dismiss her. But no one can ignore her. The hearing wasn't about policy anymore. It had become a parable. A generational pivot captured in high definition. In one exchange, Crockett had rewritten the rhythm of political confrontation. No yelling, no theatrics, just conviction dressed in composure. And for Cornyn, the sting wasn't public humiliation, it was irrelevance. He'd entered that room believing he could lecture. He left it realizing he'd just been studied. As the lights dim in the hearing chamber, Crockett gathers her papers. Neatly, quietly. No gloating, no victory smirk. Just that same steady grace, because for her, this wasn't a performance. It was purpose. She walks out the door. Flashes snapping behind her, and somewhere deep in the heart of the internet, her words play again and again. If truth sounds loud to you, maybe it's because it's echoing where silence used to be. But what happened after that moment went far beyond the chamber walls. The world doesn't wait for permission to react. It just does. Within hours, the clip ignites like wildfire. On Twitter, the first wave hits before dawn. Crockett moment climbs into the top 5 trends. Then comes Axe accountability wins, followed by the one that stings Cornyn's camp the most. By Cornyn check, the 15-second clip of Jasmine's final line. If truth sounds loud to you, loops endlessly. On TikTok, creators remix it into edits layered with slow-motion zooms, cinematic filters, and the sound of applause. On Instagram, the quote appears in bold over her still image. Calm, composed, untouchable. By sunrise, it's no longer just a political clip. It's a movement. Commentators on cable networks scramble to catch up. One host calls it a generational power shift captured in real time. Another counters, it wasn't disrespect, it was precision. Cornyn's team releases a brief statement. Bland, procedural, forgettable. Something about passionate exchanges in the pursuit of accountability. But the damage is done. The narrative isn't his to shape anymore. Jasmine Crockett has become the story. Morning shows replay the exchange frame by frame, dissecting her tone, her pause, her restraint. They freeze the moment when Cornyn leaned back, realizing he'd lost the floor. Analysts debate whether she had planned the line or whether brilliance had simply met timing. On podcasts and live streams, activists cheer. That's how you do it. Power without pandering. One voiceover creator even turns her quote into a motivational anthem, echoing where silence used to be. It spreads like gospel. By afternoon, celebrities join in. A-list actors tweet the clip with emojis. Musicians quote her words on stage. A best-selling author posts, "Grace under pressure is the loudest revolution." Even Beyoncé's team reposts the clip with a simple caption. When calm becomes power, the replies explode. Tens of thousands of retweets, millions of views. Fans caption it, Crockett energy. It's no longer about politics. It's about poise, pride, and the quiet authority of truth. Meanwhile, Cornyn's supporters attempt damage control, calling her reaction over-emotional, disrespectful, theatrics. But their words sound hollow next to the clip itself. Every rewatch dismantles their spin. Crockett hadn't yelled. She hadn't mocked. She'd owned the silence, and that, more than anything, terrifies them. By nightfall, every major outlet has picked it up. CNN. Jasmine Crockett redefines respect in politics. MSNBC. Cornyn interrupted. She interrupted history. Even neutral headlines can't resist the drama. In classrooms, professors play the clip during lectures on rhetoric and composure. High school debate teams analyze her delivery. Law students quote her in essays about gender bias and public discourse. What began as a tense Senate exchange has transformed into a cultural checkpoint, the kind people reference when describing a shift, a moment where truth pierced tradition, online. Her supporters multiply, threads fill with praise. She didn't shout, she shined. That's how you dismantle arrogance with intellect. Representation looks like this. Even late-night comedy hosts can't resist. One quips, Cornyn brought a gavel, Crockett brought a mirror. The audience roars. But beneath the humor, there's admiration, real, palpable, because everyone sees it. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about reclaiming space, about showing that dignity doesn't need to be loud to be dominant. Journalists start calling it the Crockett method. Calm, calculated, unshakable. Activists quote it at rallies. If truth sounds loud to you, crowds finish the line in unison like a chant of renewal. Somewhere, in a small Texas town, a young girl watches the replay and whispers the words along with Jasmine. For her, it's not politics, it's permission. Permission to exist, to speak, to hold her ground without apology. And that's when it becomes bigger than the clip. Because every share, every remix, every chant isn't just celebrating Crockett. It's echoing the truth she stood for. The viral storm doesn't just crown a winner. It creates a symbol. And through it all, Jasmine stays silent online. No gloating, no retweets, no statements. While the world argues, praises and debates, she's somewhere unseen, grounded, reflective. Because for Jasmine Crockett, This wasn't victory, it was reminder. Days later, the noise begins to fade. The hashtags slow, the headlines rotate, the feeds move on. But Jasmine Crockett doesn't. She steps onto a small stage in her district hall. No teleprompter. No rehearsed theatrics, just her, a microphone, and a room full of people who saw something more than a viral clip. When she speaks, her tone is steady, not defensive, not triumphant, just grounded. "I wasn't there to win a moment," she begins, her eyes scanning the crowd. "I was there to remind us why integrity matters." The words land softly, but they carry weight. You can feel it in the silence that follows, a collective exhale from a country tired of shouting. Jasmine continues. "Sometimes," she says, "we mistake volume for conviction. But the truth doesn't need to yell to be heard. It just needs to stand." Her message reframes everything. The debate, the backlash, even the praise, all of it becomes context for something deeper. She isn't glorifying confrontation, she's redefining strength. "What I learned that day," she continues, "is that when you're calm, people mistake it for weakness, until they realize calm is control." The audience nods, some recording, others simply listening. Outside, cameras capture her again, but this time it's different. The clip isn't about a clash. It's about clarity. She pauses. "We live in a time where outrage spreads faster than truth. But our job, my job, is to protect the truth, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's unpopular." Each sentence feels like a closing argument, not against Cornyn, but against the culture of noise itself. "You don't have to raise your voice to raise the standard," she adds. "You just have to refuse to lower it." For a moment, the crowd remains still. Then applause builds, not wild, not chaotic, but warm. The kind that feels earned. Reporters later note how her words transformed the tone of the entire conversation. What began as a clash in Congress had evolved into a reflection on grace, patience, and principle. Even Cornyn, noticeably absent from interviews, issues a brief statement a day later. Short, measured. He thanks her for a spirited exchange and acknowledges the importance of mutual respect in public discourse. It isn't an apology, but it doesn't need to be. His silence says what his pride won't. Online, clips of her speech circulate again, but this time, the captions shift. Dignity isn't weakness. It's leadership. The power of calm. Jasmine Crockett, turning conflict into conviction. Commentators marvel at how she turned a viral clash into a moral conversation. Activists quote her words at rallies. Teachers replay the speech in civics classes. A news anchor sums it up perfectly. She didn't just win an argument. She restored the idea that politics can still mean principle. Her final line becomes the echo of the moment. When you lead with dignity, even silence becomes power. And as she steps away from the podium, there's no music, no fanfare, just the steady hum of realization that in a world obsessed with shouting, one calm voice can still rewrite the tone of a nation. The cameras capture that quiet, the stillness before the applause, and in that silence, America found its voice. In an age of outrage, when shouting has replaced listening and spectacle has replaced sincerity, Jasmine Crockett reminded America that calm conviction is the loudest revolution. She didn't win by interrupting. She didn't win by out-yelling. She won by standing still and letting truth do the talking. That moment, when Senator John Cornyn attacked and Crockett destroyed him instantly, wasn't just a viral clip. It was a mirror, a reflection of what leadership can still look like when courage wears grace and integrity refuses to flinch. Because sometimes the most powerful sound in a room full of noise is silence that speaks the truth. This story isn't just about politics. It's about us. About how we rise when dignity is dismissed. About how we hold the line when arrogance tries to own the stage. And maybe that's why her moment mattered so much. Because for one fleeting instant, America saw what it means to stand tall without shouting, to fight without losing your peace. If you believe that respect should never go out of style, if you believe that truth is still worth defending, If you believe that calm is stronger than chaos, then don't just watch. Join. Share this story, subscribe to the channel, and be part of the movement that stands for respect over ridicule, truth over theater, and leadership that still means something. Because every time someone like Jasmine Crockett rises, every time calm triumphs over cruelty, we're reminded, dignity doesn't just win the debate, it redefines the stage. This is more than a moment, it's a message, and that message now belongs to you.